Welcome to another edition of Value My Vote 2021. I'm your host, Hassan Giordano. Most people know, but yes, Mr. Politics. But today, I'm joined by a guy who most people know him as the Legal Eagle, Ivan Bates Esquire, who has just announced his candidacy for State's Attorney here in the city of Baltimore. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Hassan. How you been?
I'm just right. I can't complain.
What's happening?
Oh, man, everything it seems to be. Look, we got to start this. I'm baffled, and it was interesting how we were talking about this. And so my mother asked me this, actually. She said, this guy is well established. My mother really likes you. She always has for years.
Beautiful woman.
She said,
beautiful woman.
You know, I voted for him before, and I think he's still the best candidate. But here's a Howard grad. He's an Army vet. He's one of the most successful defense attorneys in the region. Why in the world do you want to be state's attorney? Why do you want those headaches?
You know, I'm a big believer in when you're called, you kind of listen. But also, it's kind of what your heart wants as well. You know, after the last election, I had a lot of fun. You know, we had a show together. Spent a lot of time with my daughter, watching her grow. My mother was sick. She passed. Spent a lot of time with my family. I was just enjoying that, enjoying the practice, started to expand the practice, doing cases all around the country. And, but the one time, and the one thing, whenever I'd go out, people would say, hey, you know, Mr. Bates, I really hope you consider running for state's attorney again. I really liked you. I liked what you had to say. I found out more about you. A lot of people said, hey, I didn't vote for you last time. I'd love for you to run because I really would like to vote for you. So that got me to think. The more I began to think, the more I realized, you know, when I think about everything that I've done in my life, from my early struggles in high school to being in the Army, understanding leadership, Howard University, understanding social justice, William and Mary, understand the law, coming to Baltimore to help take care of my elderly aunt, being a state's attorney with Patricia Jessamy, understanding the practice of being a prosecutor by still doing things within the community, then going to work with a firm, having a case before the U.S. Supreme Court, and from there having my own firm, I just realized that I've done so much in my life, I've done so much in my career, I really need to give back. I love this city. I think right now the city is clearly in a direction that's not good for it. And you know, it was just the opportunity now to really give back to the city that I love and to hopefully make a difference. Because at the end of the day, yeah, I may have done all those things. I've been very blessed. My career has been amazing. I've done things I never thought I would do. But, you know, for me, I need to also let my daughter know that it's important to give back and it's important to leave a legacy to help people.
Absolutely. And speaking of former state's attorney, Patricia Jessamy, you and the current state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, both worked under her. Yes. I love to interview her and see what she thinks about this race coming up. That's interesting. But speaking of that, this office, as you said, has been under some kind of disarray, and there's been slanderous accusations that were brought. You used to be an attorney and a prosecutor under the Pat Jessamy administration. You worked in the homicide division.
Yes.
Towards the very end of the campaign in 2018, the current state's attorney tried to accuse you of not being able to, not having prosecuted a murder trial.
Yes.
Which you claim you did, and that she did not. And it's clear that she did not, but there were questions that you actually did.
Yeah.
Kind of clarify some of that.
You know, I'm one of these, sometimes I believe actions speak louder than words, so let me show you. This is called a transcript. And so if you look, this is the transcript from April 15th, 2002 in the case of Wesley Whiting. You know, this is one of the murder cases that I actually tried. And I hate the fact that sometimes we talk about politics, because that case involved someone losing their life. That case involved a gentleman who's now doing life in prison, and they've lost their family, no longer around their family. I hate when politicians basically try to manipulate the facts just to make themselves look good. But, you know, I tried cases. I've tried murder cases as a defense attorney, as a prosecutor. I've done cases on the federal side involving murders. Heck, right now I have a triple homicide that I'm doing in Los Angeles. That's the type of experience that you need for a state's attorney to have. Unfortunately, our current state's attorney has never prosecuted a murder, has never defended a murder. That's important. because right now the current state's attorney is the individual that's making the decisions about what charges to bring with murders, about what counts to bring with murders, about what are the offers for murders, and what type of evidence they try to need for murder cases. That is one of the reasons why I think we're having the uptick and we've had the problems of murders, because you have to be able to put your people, the prosecutors, in the best position possible to handle the homicides. When you have a case, not every case is a first-degree murder. Maybe it's a second-degree murder. Maybe it's a manslaughter. Therefore, you're able to get the convictions to hold people accountable. I can't stand when our prosecutor, our current state's attorney, wants to say, oh, I have an 80-some% conviction rate on my homicides. Well, no, that's not true, because you're charging people with first-degree murder, and these individuals being found guilty of only possessing a handgun or second-degree murder. You can't count that in the conviction rate of those murders. How many first-degree murder cases have you charged do you actually have convictions? From what we've seen, it may be less than 50%, maybe 43% from what I've been looking at, the numbers. And that's the type of experience that is really looked at. That's the type of experience that's needed. And so, yeah, I've been doing murders since 2002, really 2001, 2002. That's 20 years of experience having done my first homicide. And that's what I bring to that job.
And State's Attorney Mosby hasn't tried a homicide even before she was State's Attorney. Now she's been State's Attorney for 7 going on 8 years, hasn't prosecuted one case as the State's Attorney. Now, that's to their discretion, right?
Yes.
But we saw her predecessor, Greg Bernstein, pick and chose, and he
Yes.
did prosecute certain crimes. Speaking of that, of those 7 years, there's been over 300 homicides each and every year that Marilyn Mosby's been State's Attorney.
Yes.
Now, she is not the police commissioner, she's not the mayor, so all of that does not fall on her table, but is it fair to judge her based off that performance, especially since when she ran against Greg Bernstein, she used that same threshold to compare herself to Greg Bernstein, who saw 300 plus homicides. Well, it wasn't quite 300 when he was State's Attorney.
It was 200. It was 200.
But she used those numbers to compare him not being a qualified State's Attorney. Can you do the same with her?
Well, I would say normally no, it's not fair. However, that was the way in which Mrs. Mosby asked others to judge her opponent, Greg Bernstein. So since she said that's the standard in which we're judging the prosecutors, this is what she said. So therefore, you have to judge her by the standard that Mrs. Mosby has already asked to be judged by. Back then, Greg Bernstein had 200, 213, 232 murders in the time period he was State's Attorney. 1 year was 199. And then when you look at that, then you're understanding like, well, we have to look at the State's Attorney as well, because the State's Attorney's job is very important. Look, we're sitting here today as Baltimore Ravens banner. I love the Ravens, you love the Ravens, but what made the Ravens great was the defense. What made the defense great was Ray Lewis. The State's Attorney, the State's Attorney for Baltimore City, in reference to the criminal justice system, think of it like the Ravens defense. The State's Attorney is Ray Lewis. And what made Ray Lewis and that defense great wasn't just that Ray Lewis was a great player. It was that Ray Lewis worked with everybody on that team to make them great, put them in a position to be successful. And the State's Attorney must do that. And that's why you can look at judging the State's Attorney in terms of the homicide rate. You have to look at the police department. You have to empower the police department to have better investigation of homicides. You have to say, hey, we need to do this and that. We need to look at this. We need to look at that. I'm doing a murder case in Los Angeles, and I will let you know the police officers in Los Angeles, their preparation in this case has been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I've never had a murder case that I've done where I've seen police cross every T and dot every I. That's where you're looking at the training for the officers to help bring down the murder cases, because you're having those convictions. The State's Attorney has to work with the Department of Parole and Probation. They have to work with the state police. They have to work with the Department of Justice. They have to work with the federal authorities. I do a lot of federal cases. Matter of fact, I think I'm the only person who right now is announced that has experience on the federal side. Understanding what each and every single group partner within the criminal justice process brings allows me as a State's Attorney to work together to understand what do we need here, what do we need there, and how can we as a team work best. And so yes, it is correct to judge Ms. Mosby on the standard that she set. because you have to work with everybody because of the criminal justice system in Baltimore City that you look at to drive down the murder numbers, of which you are the captain, you are the leader of that group.
In 2018, you were a first-time candidate. You raised well over $300,000. First-time candidate, which was remarkable. Over 22,000 votes, over 28% of the vote. Coming in second to Mrs. Mosby, who never got 50% of the vote. In fact, you and the other opponent of Mrs. Mosby combined actually got more votes than the incumbent at the time. How will you now be able to overcome that? You've seen firsthand what a campaign looks like, what it takes to be a candidate, and the variables that go into campaigns, putting other candidates in the race, so forth and so on. What we talked about earlier with the inexcusable lies that go on in campaigns. How do you feel that has kind of brought you to this moment and prepared you for this campaign?
Well, I think anytime you go through something, you have experience. Experience in a positive sense, experience in a negative sense. I tend to look at all my life experiences as positive because you learn from them. I think what I've learned most of all is I had to understand, through a campaign, you understand who you are, what you bring and what you don't bring. For me, it is a long job interview, it's a long audition, and I think a number of things are different this race. One, I'm a different person, I'm a different man. Number two, I have a different level of name recognition. And number three, most of all, this case and this campaign really isn't just about Ivan Bates, it's about the citizens of Baltimore City. For 7 years, I think we can admit, and I thank Ms. Mosby for all that she's done. I think she has some nice ideas, but her strategy has clearly failed over this past 7 years. I think citizens want to change, and if they want to change, I am the individual to bring that change. I think when you asked me earlier, my success throughout the legal system, remember I started with nothing when I moved to Baltimore City in 1995, and now my firm has been extremely blessed, extremely successful. I understand what needs to be done to win. I understand what needs to win not only in a court proceeding, not only with a business proceeding, but I now understand what needs to be done to win this campaign. So for me, it's my experience with my background in life and going through this process before. I understand what we need to do.
Speaking of Mrs. Mosby's policies, she's come under fire as of late. She's announced trying to become the progressive candidate.
Yes.
In deciding not to prosecute crimes such as prostitution, possession, trespassing, and so forth. But these quality of life crimes have really impacted communities across the city of Baltimore. Whereas though community leaders who had once supported Mrs. Mosby now are starting to question that based off of this decision. If you were a state's attorney, would you continue these policies of not prosecuting, this blanket policy of not prosecuting these quality of life crimes?
Well, first of all, if you know anything really about the criminal justice system, where we tend to make mistakes is when you have one size fits all. You cannot do that. So people ask me, would I have her policies? No, I wouldn't have her policies, but that does not mean that I'm going to try to arrest everybody or prosecute everybody. It is definitely definitely not a one size fits all, but you have to look at the individual. For instance, let's talk about the trespass and loitering. Well, if you're going to trespass and loitering, and I go to church in New Metropolitan, right there off of McCullough Street, and so I'd like to talk about one of the members I met years ago, Miss Johnson. Miss Johnson, an elderly lady whose husband died, and she lives alone. She walks to church, but she walks past the young men who are on the corners all the time. She's afraid. So many individuals are afraid about what's happening in the community, and sometimes that fear is because they don't know one another. If you want to loiter, you want to trespass, you want to do those things, the police don't necessarily need to arrest you the first time. They need to give you a citation because at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, you will be in that neighborhood cleaning up, sweeping up. What does that do? For some people, it may say it doesn't do anything, but that's the first step in being held accountable because you're doing something to better the community that you're in. But it also lets Ms. Johnson see that you're in her community cleaning up. Eventually, your paths may cross, and eventually you two may begin to have a dialogue. And then that's how you break down the walls and the barrier what's going on. However, if you decide that you want to loiter and you want to trespass, and that's what you want to do, then eventually the police will have to deal with you because you've made the decision that you wish to be prosecuted. That's the decision you made. And so it's about holding people accountable. With prostitution, look, if that's really what you want to do, to be honest, that's your choice. But where does it have a problem with what's going on with what's in society? You can't do it in front of people's houses. And when I have problems, I have many people have problems because that's happening outside. People don't feel safe. Some of the individuals, potential Johns, they may leave things there. You have children who can find things the next morning. But what we need to do is we need to be able to approach some of the individuals that may be out there, the sex workers, and approach them not with the traditional police officers, because we looked at the Gun Trace Task Force and we could see Wayne Jenkins and they were abusing the sex workers. Their specialized unit in the Baltimore City Police Department is now disbanded, but you take this unit and you allow this unit and advocates, such as an organization I've worked with, a young lady named Natasha Gwines has an organization called HER. You let those officers maybe at that moment in time take the sex worker and pull her to the side where now she's away from the individual. Because there's a difference between prostitution and sex trafficking. I'm focused on the sex trafficking. If you're going to be a sex worker and you can do it in a safe way, in a safe space, and you're not infringing upon people's personal life and personal space, then personally, that's your personal decision. However, I need to focus on the sex trafficking, because what we're finding based on Ms. Mosby's policy is Baltimore City has now become a big hub for sex trafficking on another level, a big hub for the prostitution on another level. And where are the individuals that need help? That's why when the police now have the sex worker away from the individual that may be the pimp or whoever or the John, they can now not be the ones to talk to them per se, but now have the advocate. Do you need social services? What do you need? Are you okay? Medical help? Do you want to move? Are you being sex trafficked? Those are the individuals we want to look at, we want to focus, and we don't want to do it in a way that infringes, but we also want to do it in a way that's not involving the community in a way that they're outside of people's houses, the traffic is there all night. You know, we're going to definitely make sure we hold the Johns accountable to let them know you can't come to Baltimore City. Those are a couple of the things. Let's talk about attempt drug distribution. What does that mean? Most people don't know. I know as a lawyer what it means, but when we talk to, and we know I'm a criminal defense attorney, and we've talked to the young individuals that are out there committing some of the crimes, they believe that Ms. Mosby has now allowed drug dealing to happen. Because in their mind, attempt distribution of drugs is that you have the drugs, it doesn't matter the amount, and that you want to give it to somebody, you just haven't done it. And if that's the case, then you can't be arrested. That's their belief. And it's also their belief because as we're seeing, there are widespread drug markets, open air drug markets in people's community. You have to hold people accountable. You can't allow the drug dealing, because unfortunately drug dealing also brings the guns and the violence. We're definitely going to make sure we hold people accountable. We definitely will make sure that we have to prosecute individuals. It's the difference between prosecuting the people distributing and selling the drugs as the difference to prosecute individuals who are using the drugs. That is an issue that we have to look at in terms of getting individuals who are using drugs. Let's move them into treatment. But you just can't just blanketly do that. You have to immediately get these individuals to be assessed, to understand their issues, to understand their problems, and put them into various programs where you're helping the individuals. And if they continue, and that's what they want to do, to be on the block, to be on those corners over and over again, then we've removed now the drug distribution on the corners, and now we're focused on the individuals who are the users to get them the treatment that they need.
Speaking of, because there is a huge difference in distribution, those selling it, those using it. And again, people do need to be held accountable. And a lot of people in communities feel that people aren't being held accountable. Young people are walking around smoking marijuana right down the streets. Feels like, well, Marilyn Mosby said that it's legal now, and I'm not going to get locked up for it. And it's become misinformation in our communities. And so some of that stuff needs to be honed in. What's not been misinformation, but something that people have grown to have a problem with, especially progressives, is her continued prosecution and persecution, according to LaToya Francis Smith, of Keith Davis Jr.
Yes.
He's been tried 4 times, going on his 5th time now, from a prosecutor's office who seems to be hell-bent on making sure this young man is held behind bars for the rest of his life. He was shot multiple times by the Baltimore City Police in 2015, has gone through multiple trials. You know the story. Of course, his wife, Kelly Davis, has been an advocate of that. Mrs. Mosby was caught giving the finger to a supporter and then told her office to lie about it. So we know what the track record is. But as an average citizen who has seen this, who is upset about this, but they want to know what would Ivan Bates, the state's attorney, have done differently in this case?
Well, a couple of things. One, I can tell you I'm not going to prosecute Keith Davis. Point blank in discussion, not going to happen. I think what's happened is that you try to prosecute an individual twice, maybe 3 times max on the same evidence, and you haven't gotten it, then you're not going to proceed any longer. It's just not what's going to happen. You then have the opportunity to sit down with the detectives and investigators and look for additional information. But Keith Davis is a perfect example of you have to have the experience to understand when you have a case and you don't. If you've never prosecuted a homicide, you've never handled a homicide, you'd recognize that you just don't have the case. I think when the citizens look at me, what they'll be able to understand is that by the time we're looking at homicides, by the time we're looking at murders, my experience on the federal side, the state side, prosecuting and defending, my experience, I look at those cases for what they are. I'll make sure that I offer pleas that are fair to the community, to protect the community, and that will hold individuals accountable. But I'm not going to go on witch hunts. The most important thing a prosecutor can't do, it's not about it's not about me, it's about we. What is the best for the community? When you look at what's happened with Keith Davis, it's terrible. This man has gone through a lot, and you also look at the victim's family. You feel for them. But when I've looked at that case, and I've had the opportunity to look at it pretty in depth, I would have wanted to see a number of different things happen with the investigation. And I think when those things have happened, the fingers don't point toward Keith, Mr. Davis. I think as a prosecutor, you're going to make a lot of tough calls. They're not always going to be popular. But I find when people are you're able to articulate and explain those calls to individuals, and they know that your heart was in the right position, in the right direction, people they may not like it, but they'll accept it. And I think now we just need to stop the prosecution and persecution of Keith Davis. And I can say the same thing about another young man, Adnan, in looking at that as well. Those are 2 cases that have bothered me immensely and bothered me greatly. But there are other individuals in the system as well.
So you've represented quite a lot of clients, including Sergeant Alicia White, who was one of the officers charged in the death of Freddie Gray. All of those officers were either found not guilty or their charges were dismissed. But during your last run for office, many people had looked at you as the FOP attorney because of the fact that those attorneys were represented by the Fraternal Order of Police, and you represented Ms. White. Many of people have come to find out later on that, he wasn't actually their attorney, he was her attorney. But for those who still feel that you are the attorney for the FOP or for the police, explain to the viewers your representation of Sergeant Alicia White in the Freddie Gray case.
I will always remember, I was actually in this room here when I received the call. I think it was May 1st of 2015, and the other end of the line was a woman crying. And when you're black, you can hear the voice of another black individual. And I could tell it was a black woman, and she was crying. And I had her come in, I talked to her, and I heard what Mrs. Mosby had accused her of, and I asked her story. She gave me her story. I asked her story again, gave me her story. I left, talked to my law partner, Tony Garcia, came back, we reviewed the story again, same story every single time. At that moment in time, I'll never forget, Tony and we went to his office and we talked, and I knew that case was not gonna sit well with people, because as a black man who's also suffered the hands of police, and you deal with police brutality, not only through myself, but its clients, that I was, quote unquote, going to fight on behalf of a police officer. But I didn't see Alicia White as a police officer. I saw Alicia White as a black woman facing a criminal justice system that was only looking at her based on who they thought she was. They didn't look at the facts. I'd seen it happen so many times to our people. And having seen that happen so many times to our people, I knew that I needed to do something. Now, what I will say is in taking that case, I learned a great deal about the way the police department interacts, the great deal of the way police are trained, the great deal in the way that police are supposed to they have general orders, their rules, their Bible of police work. And what no one realized was the same time I was doing Alicia White's case and I would go to court and people would yell at me, I was going to the jails and I was talking to individuals that are being locked up by Wayne Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force. The lessons I learned from representing Alicia White allowed me to represent my clients better in holding Wayne Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force officers accountable. What's so interesting and so amazing to me is so many people gave me heat and were angry because I represented Alicia White, but they gave the state's attorney a pass for allowing the atrocities of Wayne Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force. I took this information about the Gun Trace Task Force to the Baltimore City States Attorney's office. I'll never forget what this one male prosecutor told me. He told me he wasn't worried about, they had body camera video showing that Wayne Jenkins and Herschel broke into my client's house. They weren't worried about that. They just wanted a conviction for the stats, is what he told me. So the prosecutor's office really wasn't worried about the Gun Trace Task Force. So yeah, I represented Sergeant Alicia White. That was my case. But for the victims of the Gun Trace Task Force, that was my cause. My experience with Sergeant Alicia White, my experience as a defense attorney, my experience as a prosecutor, my experience representing her allowed me to know what I needed to do to hold the corrupt police accountable. Unfortunately, the prosecutors in Baltimore City weren't able to do that. I was able then to take that information over to the U.S. Attorney's Office, along with what was going on with my clients, give it to the U.S. attorneys, and from there, the rest is history. Wayne Jenkins is doing 25 years, a number of officers have also been held accountable. So yeah, I represented a black woman who was a police officer, but I really protected and represented a whole group of black African Americans who were being terrorized by the Baltimore City Division of the Gun Trace Task Force under Wayne Jenkins.
Speaking of corruption, you represented also Javon and Jamal Walker, getting their case thrown out, and it was evidence that showed the corruption of the Gun Trace Task Force. And you accused the state's attorney's office of withholding information on Officer Ram.
Yes.
What happened in that case that specifically looked at the state's attorney's office and their dereliction of duty?
Well, that case wasn't exactly Officer Ram. That was Officer Wayne Jenkins and Officer Keith Gladstone. In that particular case, you know, here you have a black man, him and his wife, electrician, the man during the day, wife was a nurse as well during the day, through a number of parties, and their parties they had thrown had a great deal of cash, stopped to see his buddy on the corner, and that's where Gladstone and Wayne Jenkins approached them, pretty much pull him to the side, start searching his car. They said that, it's Mr. Walker, say they find a marijuana blunt in his vehicle. Turns out that they used that marijuana blunt to arrest Mr. Walker. He had about $43,000 in cash from parties, was on his way to the bank, and they took around $23,000. They arrested Mr. Walker. They then take the keys from Mr. Walker's possession. They go back to their house, where him and his wife live with their family. They knock on the door. She's afraid. She sees two white men in her neighborhood, it was a predominantly black neighborhood in the city, trying to break in. She gets afraid. She hits the panic alarm button and calls the police. From there, I call them the real officers from Baltimore City, they respond, and when they responded to the location, Wayne Jenkins and Keith Gladstone tell them, oh, there's nothing to see here. They send them along their way. They search the house, find a shotgun in the house, and then from there they arrest Mrs. Walker, Mr. Walker, and they trump up charges against them. I was fighting this case, and it wasn't until I was able to get the information from the alarm company and give it to the prosecutor, and that's when the prosecutor realized that Wayne Jenkins and Keith Gladstone had lied. That information never made it to their internal affairs file. Their internal affairs file that the state's attorney's office wasn't given to me during that time period, and later on, even in Ms. Mosby's administration, they still weren't giving me the items in the internal affairs file. They were hiding that information. Thanks to the work of Senator Jill Carter and so many others in the legislature, we no longer have those same issues with the personnel files that we had back then. So even then, I was fighting and I was telling people these officers are corrupt. And the state's attorney's office just didn't want to listen. But once again, you know, Hassan, I keep coming back. You have to have real experience, practical experience in handling these types of cases. And this is an experience that happens in a year or 2 years. It's not just leadership. It's not just handling murder cases. It's handling cases at every single level, understanding how the system works and understanding where you need to make the change and how to hold people accountable for the criminal justice system, especially the police who are doing the wrong things.
So explain this to the viewers, because I have to know, it's the elephant in the room. You're going against an opponent who is facing possible criminal charges from a federal investigation that's going on from the U.S. Attorney's Office, possible charges from the state prosecutor based off of campaign finance violations, an individual who, as we talked about, with a vendetta against the Keith Davis Jr. and what's going on in the supporters of Keith Davis Jr. And now you have the governor of the great state of Maryland, who has now just recently, earlier today, called for the audit of that office, especially based off of, I'm assuming, monies that went through that office on an annual fundraiser that the state's attorney's office did, that they can't really show items that were brought through there. How do you run against an opponent like that and not highlight what the public has seen for the past 7 years?
Well, look, right now you're always innocent until proven guilty. Right now, Ms. Mosby has not been charged with anything whatsoever. But I think one of the things that's very difficult, when I talked about the criminal justice system, one of the people who you need most are the federal, on the Department of Justice, the federal side. And so if they're investigating you, that's a strained relationship. You need individuals from the support side of the state. Once again, that's a strained relationship. Those relationships aren't benefiting the citizens of Baltimore City, and we're focused on too many other things. If you can't, the average voter, if they can't sit out there and they don't see that a change is needed, sometimes you just need to move on. This has nothing to do with the person of Mrs. Mosby, whether or not you like or don't like. This has everything to do with what's going on in Baltimore City and the abject failure of the past 7 years. That failure is where we are right now. And so do I, as a criminal defense attorney, yeah, there's a number of things I think about and say, but as an opponent, I can't worry about that. Those are the problems that, unfortunately, Mrs. Mosby has to deal with. I have to be focused on making sure the citizens of Baltimore City know who Ivan Bates is, know what I plan to do, know my background, the job that I plan to do, and know that I will have their best interest. You know, as a criminal defense attorney, I've been very blessed, built this practice, and there's always going to be a landmine in life. That's just how it is. But you know, my faith always says, let me move forward, and at the end of the day, God will make sure. You know, He's always blessed me, had me, and kept me. And that's all I can continue to focus on.
Well, it appears that her and her husband, City Council President Nick Mosby, need to hire Bates and Garcia.
That would definitely be a conflict of interest.
Would you take them on as a client? No, we're not going to do that. So for those who are watching, who want to learn more about Ivan Bates, who want to know more about the campaign state's attorney in 2022, how can they find out more about that?
Well, they can go to our website, batesforbaltimore.com, BATESFOR, Baltimore.com. You can reach out to me on Twitter, Ivan J. Bates, or Instagram, Ivan J. Bates. You can always email me at my law office, ivan@batesgarcia.com. And those are the ways right now you reach out. But Bates for Baltimore is the best way to reach myself, my campaign, get involved, find out who we are, find out the different things that we can bring and we can add and the change we can make in this city. And things like this is an excellent opportunity, and I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity and being interested in what I have to say, what I have to give to the citizens of Baltimore City.
Well, I think the people, when the citizens are interested, I said this on social media, people responded in kind, but I think it's true. This is the heavyweight championship. This is part 2 of Bates versus Mosby, all right? This is what we call unfinished business. I'm going to sell pay-per-view tickets to this one right here because this is the political battle of the year next year in Baltimore City. So I think everybody should be paying attention to this race and the candidates in this race, i.e. you and Mrs. Mosby, and what's going to come about it, because at the end of the day, we're failing on so many levels in Baltimore City, and we got to get it right. And so they need to really look into the candidates that are vying for their vote. So we appreciate you joining us and giving us that information.
I appreciate you, and at the end of the day, the one thing, my father, I'm watching him teach my daughter, and he taught me is the golden rule. And the golden rule is you treat others the way you want to be treated. And for me, in handling this campaign, I'm going to do the job as a state's attorney. The citizens elect me the way that I would want the state's attorney to work on my behalf, on my daughter's behalf, on our behalf. That's all I can do. That's all I've ever done, is how I've decided to handle my business as a lawyer, my law practice, and just my relationships in life. I'm not perfect, none of us are, but I try to learn from my mistakes, and I try to do the best I can for the people. And that's why this is so important to me. And so when you started out the early question, why? At the end of the day, why not? Someone needs to. I love this city. The city's been amazing to me. My daughter was born here. This is where my family is. And someone needs to do something, and that someone is me.
All right, now, you heard it from him himself. I'm J. Bates, Esquire, in the building, in the flesh. And we'll be back with more Value My Vote 2021.